I just bought a $200 piece of meat. And I don't want to screw it up. And I bet you don't either. So I'm going to show you how you can make a prime rib that comes out right every time. Salt crusted prime rib. Let me show you how it's done. To get started, you'll need your roast, of course, plus fresh ground pepper, coarse sea salt, fresh garlic, kitchen bouquet browning sauce, kitchen twine, cheesecloth, and your favorite beef broth, about 2 cups. Set your oven to preheat at 500 degrees. All right, today I'm going to show you how I cook a prime rib. This is standing rib roast. It's not a prime rib. Prime has to do with the type of cut. This is actually a choice. So it's still going to be good though. So if you can afford prime, then get prime, but choice is really good as well. So I'm going to first cut this thing out of its cryo pack. And let's take a second here, cut through the plastic. I like to do this near the sink if I can because it drains out quite a bit. And a lot of the juice and stuff can drain out onto the counter if you're not careful. So we'll take this out and peel it out. There we go. So this, once you see this, you can see that there is a lot of juice and kind of bloodish type stuff. So I usually take a little bit of paper towel and wipe that off so I can get a better idea of what the ribs look like. So today I'm just cooking a small one because it's just for my wife and I, and we're just going to cook just a little bit. So I'm going to take a couple of ribs. You can see them here. You can count them on this side. There's 1 and 2. This one happens to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 ribs long. So we're just going to do a 2 ribber. It's more than enough than what we can eat, but we're going to have leftovers. So I just like to cut down in between. The ribs. Use a sharp knife. That makes a lot of difference when you're cutting this sort of thing, so you're not hassling with it. So that is actually the rib roast, standing rib roast that we're going to cut and use today. That's the one we're going to use today. So the rest of this, what you can do is cut it up into smaller roasts or use it as steaks. So if you wanted to just cut a big steak off of here, you could. I'm going to actually make this into roasts, so we'll do that. Okay, so now that we've got this meat cut off, the first thing I like to do is to cut it away from the bone. And the only reason I do this is, yes, indeed, I cook it against the bone, but I like to do this so that it's so much easier to carve afterwards. So you just pull it right off the bone and then you can carve it. That way you're carving just the meat and not have to fight with the bones during the carving process. So there's the actual meat and there's the actual bone that we're going to actually use. We're not tossing this out, we're going to cook with it. But first we need to do a little bit of prep work. One of the things I like to do is try to remove some of the fat. So there is a fair amount of fat on these to begin with, and you need a little bit of fat, but you don't need all of it. So I like to trim it down just a little bit, usually about 1/4 inch or so of fat is fine for most everything that you're going to need. And you know, if you leave a little fat on extra, you don't want anything that's going to be chewy, so you kind of pull that stuff off. Make sure that you're not cooking too much fat. So that's pretty good. Meat looks pretty good, and we're going to still use these bones as we roast. So here's how we set this up. I use a cheesecloth, and this is, you can find in the canning supplies of your regular grocery store. And I like to fold it out. And you're not ever going to hardly ever use the whole package worth. You just need a bit of it. So what we're going to do is cut that, and then I spread this out on the cutting board so that I have just a big wide swath of this netting. Real simple. There we go. And I take, the very first thing that I do is I set my bones on the center of this netting. And I set this aside for a quick second or two. Then what I like to do is I like to take garlic. So this is ground up garlic that I have ground up already, minced in a mincer. So I like to slather that on. And I use, depending on how big the roast is, I use 4 to 5 cloves of minced garlic sitting right in there. Makes it smell really good while it's cooking. Then what I like to do is add a little bit of seasoning down here. And the easiest way is to bring in a little bit of kosher salt and sprinkle that on the beef. Not a lot, because we're going to add a whole bunch of salt in a little bit. And then a little bit of pepper, fresh ground. And now we're ready to slap this on. So that's how that's ultimately going to go back together when we're ready to cook. So now what we need to do is we need to season this. But the first thing we're going to do before we season it is we're going to, let's get some of that garlic back on there. We're going to rub it with Kitchen Bouquet. Kitchen Bouquet is a browning sauce, and it actually works really good for this recipe. Thought I had one that was open. So I just use a little bit, and I like to rub it all over the roast. It's a browning, going to add some browning to it, will make it look nice, but also I use it as a glue to adhere the rock salt that we're about to put on. So we end up putting rock salt over this entire piece of meat so that it cooks and keeps all the juices inside. The rock salt will keep the juice inside of the meat. So there again, completely rubbed over with this. Then the next step, it's kind of important to do this way, is you want to do the next step of grinding in some pepper, because pepper is going to roast in the whole time. So let's go ahead and do that. And I use a pretty rough grind on my pepper, fresh ground of course, so that when you can see that grind is pretty thick. It's a lot of crunchiness to it, not super fine. And I like to do all the sides. So now I go ahead and put the meat back on with the roast onto the bones. And next step is to add some salt. I use a very coarse rock salt, kind that you can get in the store fairly cheap. You can see that it's pretty thick grind. We sprinkle it all over the roast, on all the sides, across the top. Now the downside of this recipe is that you don't really have any juice that you can make gravy with it, but I prefer to make gravy a separate way anyway, so it never seems to be a super big problem of not having juice drippings for the gravy. I just cook it like this, and then I can knock this salt off afterwards. So now this is all salted. Now all I need to do is I use the cheesecloth to wrap this up so that it's all wrapped together and can hold together and keep the salt attached to the meat. I do it just like that. Okay, go ahead and tie that on. So sometimes it's easier just to have somebody tie it on for you while you keep it nice and tight. So I've enlisted the wife to tie it up in a nice little knot. Good, thank you. So then we take and scissor off these little bits. There you have it. Roast is ready to bake. And we'll set up the oven and bake it. So the next step, what I do is I put everything into the roasting rack. So a rack goes in the roasting rack. I also take and put some beef stock at the bottom of the pan. And I do this so when the roast drips, it doesn't burn onto the pan, and it adds a little bit of steam. I think it keeps the meat moist. So then we set that on this, and then we just put it into the oven, 500 for about 20 minutes. It's very important to make sure that you turn the oven down after 20 minutes, because if you forget this step, you're going to ruin your meat. So 20 minutes, remind yourself, turn the oven down. So I like to use the Dot by ThermoWorks. And I simply plug it in, and then that probe goes into the roast as I'm cooking it. So bake your roast at 225 degrees. For planning purposes, figure on about 20 minutes per pound. But don't rely just on time. Always use a good thermometer to check the internal temperature of the center of the meat. I use an instant read thermometer from ThermoWorks. We like our prime rib cooked to medium rare. So I take it out at 125 degrees and let it rest. I just set it on a cutting board uncovered. During the 30 to 45 minute resting process, the internal temperature will rise to the perfect medium rare. Obviously, if you want a different doneness of the meat, pick a temperature that you like. Remember to count on it raising about 10 more degrees while it's resting. So I took off the cheesecloth, knocked off all the salt, and we're ready to carve. Let's see how this looks. And there we have it. Standing rib roast or prime rib roast, whichever you like. So that's my recipe for salt-crusted prime rib. I'll put links down in the description for any of the products that I used in making the video. If you like what you saw, share it with somebody or give it a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon if you want to be notified of future videos. Thanks again for watching.